Chairman.
Thank you. I don't think you'll find much disagreement with that proposition, but to have American workers do those jobs, we need to train them, correct? And you all, in some sense, because you're all teachers, you're all professors, are engaged in that enterprise. Mr. Amadeo, I don't know whether you can be called still a professor, but probably not.
I was never a professor.
But we need to train workers to do these jobs. And for those who want to pause, and some of the experts have written that we should pause AI development, I don't think it's going to happen. We right now have a gold rush, literally much like the gold rush that we had in the Wild West, where in fact there are no rules and everybody's trying to get to the gold without very many law enforcers out there preventing the kinds of crimes that can occur. So I am totally in agreement with Senator Hawley in focusing on keeping it in America, made in America when we're talking about AI. And I think he is absolutely right that we need to build those kinds of structures, provide the training and incentives that enable it and enforce it. Let me, though, come back to this issue of national security. Who are our competitors among our adversaries and our allies? Who are closest to the United States in terms of developing AI? Is it China? Are there other adversaries out there that could be rogue nations, not just rogue actors, but rogue nations, and whom we need to bring into some international body of cooperation?
So I think the closest competitor we have is probably the UK in terms of making advances in basic research, both in academia and in DeepMind in particular, which is based in London, now being merged more forcefully into the larger Google organization. But they have a very distinct approach, and they've created an ecosystem in the UK that's really quite productive. I've spent a fair amount of time in China. I was there a month ago talking to the major institutions that are working on AGI. And my sense is that we have slightly overstated the level of threat that they currently present. They've mostly been building copycat systems that turn out not to be nearly as good as the systems that are coming out from Anthropic and OpenAI and Google. So, but the intent is definitely there. I mean, they've publicly stated their goal to be the world leader, and they are investing probably larger sums of public money than we are in the US, smaller sums in the private sector. The areas where they are actually most effective, and I was actually on a panel in Tianjin for the top 50 Chinese AI startups, and they were giving out awards. But I think about 40 of those 50, their primary customer was state security. So they're extremely good at voice recognition, face recognition, tracking and recognition of humans based on gait, and similar capabilities that are useful for state security. Other areas like reasoning and so on, planning, they're just not in, they're not really that close. So they have a pretty good academic sector that they are in the process of ruining by forcing them to meet numerical publication targets and things like that. They don't give people the freedom to think hard about the most important problems, and they are not producing the basic research breakthroughs that we've seen both in the academic and the private sector in the US.
Hard
I'm
to
also
produce a superhuman thinking machine if you don't allow humans to think.
Yep. I've also looked a lot at European countries. I'm working with the French government quite a bit, and I don't think anywhere else is in the same league as those three. Russia, in particular, has been completely denuded of its experts and was already well behind.
Mr. Bengio, Professor.
On the allied side, there are a few countries, including Canada, from which I come from, that have really important concentration of talent in AI. And in Canada, we've contributed a lot of the principles behind what we're seeing today. There's also a lot of really good European researchers in the UK and outside the UK. So I think that we would all gain by making sure we work with these countries to develop these countermeasures, as well as the improved understanding of the potentially dangerous scenarios and what methodologies in terms of safety can protect us.
You've advocated decentralized labs.
Yes.
But under
a common umbrella that would be multilateral. Maybe this could be a good starting place could be Five Eyes or G7, and that would capture pretty much the bulk of the expertise in these very strong AI systems that could be important here.
And there would probably be some way for our entity, our national oversight body, doing licensing and registration to still cooperate. In fact, I would guess that's one of the reasons to have a single entity, to be able to work and collaborate with other countries.
There's no doubt that individual countries have their own national security organizations and are going to do their own laws. But the more we can coordinate on this, the better. Of course, I think some of that research should be classified and not shared with anyone, only trusted parties. So there are aspects of what we have to do that have to be really broad at the international level. And I think the guidelines or the maybe mandatory rules for safety should be something we do internationally, like with the UN. Like we want every country to follow some basic rules, because even if they don't have the technology, some rogue actor, even here in the US, might just go and do it somewhere else, and then viruses, computer or biological viruses don't see any border. So we need to make sure there's an international effort in terms of these safety measures. We need to agree with China on these safety measures as the first interlocutor. And we need to work with our allies on these countermeasures.
I think that all those observations are extremely timely and important. And on the issue of safety, I know that Anthropic has developed a model card for Claude that essentially involves evaluation capabilities. Your red teaming considered the risk of self-replication or a similar kind of danger. OpenAI engaged in the same kind of testing. We've been talking a lot about testing and auditing. So apparently you share the concern that these systems may get out of control. Professor Russell recommended an obligation to be able to terminate an AI system. Microsoft called this requirement safety breaks. When we talk about legislation, would you recommend that we impose that kind of requirement as a condition for testing and auditing the evaluation that goes on when deploying certain AI systems? Obviously, again, focusing on risk. I think everybody has talked about systems that are vulnerable, risk systems, an AI model spreading like a virus seems a bit like science fiction, but these safety breaks could be very, very important to stop that kind of danger. Would you agree?
Yes. So I think I for one think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, the way I would think about it is, you know, in the testing and auditing regime that we've all discussed, you know, the best case is if all of these dangers that we're talking about don't happen in the first place, because we run tests that detect the dangers, and there's basically prior restraint, right? If these things are a concern for public safety and national security, we never want the bad things to happen in the first place. But precisely because we're still getting good at the science of measurement, probably it will happen at least once, and unfortunately perhaps repeatedly, that we run these tests, we think things are safe, and then they turn out not to be safe. And so I agree. We also need a mechanism for recalling things if or modifying things if the tests ended up being wrong. So that seems like common sense to me for sure.
And I think there's been some talk about auto GPT. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how that relates to safety breaks.
Yes. So auto GPT refers to use of, you know, currently deployed AI systems, which are not designed to be agents, right? Which are just chatbots, but kind of commandeering such systems for taking actions on the internet. You know, to be honest, such systems are not particularly effective at that yet, but they may be a taste of the future and the kinds of things we're worried about in the future, the long-term risks that I described in the short, medium, and long-term risks. So I don't, as of yet, see a particularly high amount of danger from things like the system you described, but it tells us where we're going, and where we're going is quite concerning to me.
You know, in some of the areas that have been mentioned, like medicines and transportation, there are public reporting requirements. For example, when there's a failure, the FAA's system has an accident and incident report. They collect data about failures in those kinds of machinery, and it serves as a warning to consumers. It creates a deterrence for putting unsafe products on the market, and it adds to oversight of public safety issues. We've discussed this afternoon both short-term and long-term kinds of risks that can cause very significant public harm. It doesn't seem like AI companies have an obligation to report issues right now. In other words, there's no place to report it. They have no obligation to make it known. If they discover the, oh my God, how did that happen, incident, it can be entirely undisclosed. Would you all favor some kind of requirement for that kind of reporting?
Absolutely.
And it may be obvious, but let me ask all of you. I see, again, your heads nodding for the record. Would that inhibit creativity or innovation to have that kind of requirement? I would think not.
I don't think. I mean, there are many areas where there's important trade-offs. I don't think this is one of them. I think such requirements make sense. I mean, to give a little of our experience in, you know, red teaming for these biological harms, you know, we've had to work on, you know, piloting a responsible disclosure process. I think that's less about reporting to the public, more about making the other companies aware, but, you know, the two things are similar to each other. So, you know, a lot of this is being done on voluntary terms, and you see some of it coming up in the, you know, the commitments that the 7 companies make. But yeah, I think there's a lot of legal and process infrastructure that's missing here and should be filled in.
Yeah, I think to go along with the notion of an involuntary recall, there has to be that reporting step happening first.
You know, you mentioned recalls. Both Senator Hawley and I were state attorneys general before we got this job, and both of us are familiar with consumer issues. One of the frustrations for me always was that even with a recall, a lot of consumers didn't do anything about it. And so I think the recall as a concept is a good one, but there have to be teeth to it. There has to be a cop on the beat a cop on the AI beat. And I think the enforcement powers here are tremendously important. And the point that you made about the tremendous amount of money is very important. You know, right now it's all private funding, or mostly private funding. But the government has an obligation to invest. I think all of you would agree. Invest in safety, just as it has in other technology and innovation, because we can't rely on private companies to police themselves. That cop on the beat in the AI context has to be not only enforcing rules, but as I said at the very beginning, incentivizing innovation and sometimes funding it to provide the airbags and the seat belts and the crash-proof kinds of safety measures that we have in automobile industry. I recognize that the analogy is imperfect, but I think the concept is there. Senator Hawley?
This has been a tremendously helpful hearing.